So now that we've created our virtual machine, before we install the operating system, I want to make a couple of tweaks to it. So if I go into the settings of the virtual machine, first thing is I want to change the boot order. By default with these Generation 2 virtual machines, they want to boot off the network adapter. We want to change that, and we actually want it to start off the DVD drive because that's how we're going to install our operating system. And then even once that's done, we want it to start off the hard drive, not the network adapter. So put the DVD first, hard drive second, network adapter third. Cool. So I'm just going to apply that before I carry on. The other thing I want to do is in my virtual processors here, it only does one virtual processor by default, which can be pretty slow for some stuff. So we're going to bump it up to 2 virtual processors because that will make a difference in our life. So apply that change and click OK. Now we should be good to go. So I am going to connect to the virtual machine, and that gives me my virtual machine window here. What you're going to see in a couple of seconds is I'm going to make my virtual machine viewing full screen just so I can see what's going on a little bit better, because I'm recording at a fairly small size to make it easier for you guys to see the video. But you guys can have a much larger screen and probably won't have a need to do that. So first thing, I'm going to do my start button. And when I do that, it says press a key to boot from CD or DVD, so that's what I'm going to do. And apparently it didn't work. So let's try that again. I wasn't fast enough the last time. There, now we go. Now we're looking good. So I'm just going to maximize this so it shows up better on the screen. The other thing I should note when you're doing that boot from DVD, you might need to click inside that window when it's showing the message before you press the spacebar or some other key, just so that Hyper-V understands that you want to be interacting with the virtual machine. So first part of Windows setup, if you've never done it before, it just asks about keyboard layout and languages. Defaults of English and US keyboard layout are probably a good way to go. And click Install Now. So once we click Install Now, it's going to come up and it's going to ask us a little bit about where we want to install the operating system and stuff like that, but it takes a few seconds for it to set up. Alright, it's going to ask us for a license key. We don't have a license key. We're just going to go in trial mode for what you guys are using. So you can just click on this, I don't have a product key. And then it will take you to the window where you get to choose which version of the operating system you want to install. For our purposes, it doesn't make a difference whether we install standard or whether we install data center, but we definitely want the desktop experience. The desktop experience means you get the graphical interface. If you don't do desktop experience, you're going to get a version with only a command line interface, which means no clicking, no graphical tools, which is not what we want for you guys. And we are going to accept the license terms. And it gives us a choice of upgrading or a custom install. Very rare you would do an upgrade nowadays, so custom is what we want to do. And it asks us what hard drive we want to put it on. Well, we only have the one hard drive, so we're going to select that, and next. And when we select that one big unallocated hard drive, it actually in the background takes care of doing the partitioning for us. So it actually divides it into the chunks that we need. And then this process here where it copies files and installs Windows will probably take about 10 or 15 minutes. Alright, after the install does most of its file copying and detects hardware and reboots a couple of times and all that sort of stuff, it comes up and it's going to ask us for a password for the administrator account. You are creating this password. You are the only one who is going to know this password, so you are responsible for remembering this password. If you forget your passwords, nobody else knows your passwords, so please write it down. Put in the password, click finish, and we're on our way. See if I can get Control-Alt-Delete from here. No. Sorry, I'm going to have to shrink this down. Do my Control-Alt-Delete. I can bring it back up again. So when you first install your server or your server, the only account that exists by default is this administrator account. That again, you defined the password for, and you're the only one who knows it. And then once our server comes up, we'll do a little bit of basic configuration on it. We'll set it up with computer name and an IP address. So again, our main administrative console for Windows Server 2016 is Server Manager. So we're going to start that up. So don't be alarmed by this warning icon in the lower right hand corner about networking. That's going to appear anytime that a computer cannot connect to the internet, and that is expected for us in our scenario, so we're good with that. So whenever you install a computer in or a Windows Server 2016 server, it generates a random computer name, and we don't want a random computer name. We want something that makes a little bit more sense. So for my purposes, I'm going to rename this guy Server. And you would be going through a similar process in Windows 10 once you've installed your client machines as well. You're going to rename those also. And whenever you rename them, you're going to be forced to restart. Whoops, that didn't work the way I hoped. Just need to do my Control-Alt-Delete again here. Alright, so we're logged in, the computer name has changed, but we want to give this a static IP address also. So my computer is now named Server, and I want to set up an IP address, so I'm just going to click here for the settings for my Ethernet network. And go into the properties of my network card. And IP version 4 is what we care about. So I'm just going to give this 192.168.0.10. 192.168 anything is an internal network. Quite honestly, we're isolated, so it doesn't matter. But this is a range of IP addresses that is designated for internal networks and isn't valid on the internet. And I'm not even going to bother putting in a default gateway because we are not going to be going out to the internet with these virtual machines. Now I am going to put in 10 as the DNS server. So this server is going to be my domain controller, and as part of that it also uses DNS. I'll explain that a little later on. So I've got our basic networking, other stuff we probably want to configure, time zone. So change it to central time so it doesn't mess with our head as we're looking at things. And that is it. That is our basic configuration for a server. So the next thing I'm going to show you is how to set up your server as a domain controller. So in a Windows-based network, we have a database that lists all the users and all the computers that exist on our network, and it does some other things as well, but that's the core of what we care about for right now. And a server that holds a copy of that database is called a domain controller. So it's kind of the central server that's used for authentication and authorization on your network. So we want to set up our server to be a domain controller, and then what's going to happen afterwards is we're going to get our workstations to join that domain. So what I want to do is I want to go to Manage and Add Roles and Features. And when I start going through this wizard, I want a role-based or feature-based install, because we're not doing the remote desktop services thing. This is the server we're going to set up. I'm not sure why it still has that wacky address in there, because it shouldn't. Yeah, we're good there. I'm just going to do a refresh and try that one more time. Yeah, it just had bad information cached. I did a refresh and it's all good. So we're picking our server to do the install on, and the server role we want is called Active Directory Domain Services. And when it pops up asking about features, yeah, you just add them. So Active Directory Domain Services, you may read documentation that just refers to it as Active Directory. So step one is getting that role installed. We don't need to pick any specific features, and it just gives us a little bit of an overview of Active Directory Domain Services, and we'll tell it to restart automatically if it needs to. It may not need to. Alright, now that the basic install of the feature is done, we can close this window, and it tells us additional configuration is required, because really all that did was copy the files for us. It didn't actually set it up as a domain controller. So the easiest way to do the setup is if we go to our notifications here, it has the option promote this server to a domain controller. Let's do it. So we do not have any domains, we do not have any forests. I'll save you guys from the complexity of what our options are there, but we're going to do what's called creating a new forest. And in naming our forest, we're going to name it something.local. That's not a best practice from a real world perspective, but because these are like DNS domain names, actually, you know what? It's an isolated environment. You can name it whatever you want. But I'm going to go with something.local, just because I know for sure there'd be no conflict on the internet. From a real world perspective, you would normally like to register this domain name before you actually begin to use it. So I'm going to call my domain name byron.local. You could do something like name yours whatever group.local, then that will work. This forest and functional domain level, again, this is for backward compatibility. We're creating something brand new, so just leave it at defaults. We also do want to set up our server to be a DNS server. That's required as part of the whole Active Directory thing. And we do want it to be a global catalog. Again, I'll save you from the complexity, but almost always you want your domain controller to be a global catalog server. Now it's also going to ask you for a password again. That's because the local administrator account that you created when you first installed this server gets wiped out as part of setting up Active Directory. So again, you need to give it a password. And that's going to be your new administrator password. You do not need to create DNS delegation because there's nothing we're integrating with. So leave that turned off. And it's going to give us a NetBIOS domain name. And it's just kind of doing a quick search right now to make sure nobody else is using the one it's going to try and use. So basically what it does is it just drops the .local from the end. This is again an old backward compatibility thing. Just leave it at the default and you're good. And for the paths here, it's just where does it want to install the Active Directory database and log files and stuff like that. So the default location is good. And it gives us a summary of our stuff. We know what we're doing, so we're all good. Click Next. And it's going to run a prerequisite check for us. And it gives us a few warnings, but these are not warnings that matter for us. So let's install. Alright, it can take a while to do that first startup after you've set it up as a domain controller, but once you do, you're going to log in. And now when you log in, it's going to have the name of your domain, / and then administrator, because it created that new account in the domain. Alright, so Server Manager is starting up automatically for us, but while it's doing that, let's take a look at some of the other things that are in here. So first up on our list, I wanted to show you guys something called Active Directory Users and Computers. This is where we go to create new user accounts. So you can see inside of here we've got my domain name byron.local, and inside that it's got a few different containers here. Inside domain controllers, my server named server. For users, there's a whole bunch of default groups in here, but really the only user that we've got going on in here right now is our main administrator account. So again, there's a whole bunch of different things we can do. So I'm going to create just something that's kind of typical. Let's say we've got an accounting department. So I'm going to create a new organizational unit for an accounting department. And inside the accounting department, I'm going to create a new user account. And the user I'm going to create is Jeff Smith. And I'm going to keep it nice and simple, and I'm just going to make Jeff as his logon name. give Jeff a password. And best practice is to force users to change their password at next logon. And the reason you want to do that is because I, as an administrative person, never want to know what somebody's password actually is, right? Because from an auditing perspective, auditing is only valid if they are the only person who knows their password. So I would never ask someone for their password. I can reset their password, I can get them to log in for me, but I would never ask somebody for their password. So we'll leave that and finish. So now you can see we've got a user Jeff, and we can also create a group for the accounting department. And in terms of types of groups, you don't need to worry about the group scope. Global is good. That works for our purposes. And the other type of we do want to make it a security group because that means we can assign permissions. So if it's a security group, we can give the whole group access to files. We can give the whole group access to different things. So we've got the group named accounting, and I'm going to add Jeff to that group. Done deal. So we've seen how to create a user, we've seen how to create a group, we've seen how to add members to a group. Other things that are worth being aware of. Let's take a quick look at setting up a file share. So right now we've only got our C drive on this server. So again, under normal circumstances, the preference would be to add another virtual disk to your server virtual machine and then use that to put your file share stuff on. Because again, from a real world perspective, we just normally prefer to have separate operating system and data disks. For demo purposes, I'm just going to do another folder here and I'm going to share it out. So I'm going to do a new folder, and I'm going to call it data. And then inside that data folder, I'm going to create another new folder called accounting. And another new folder, sales. And actually, just so I can complete my overall scenario here, I'm going to go back into Active Directory Users and Computers and create a sales group. And I'll set up a separate OU for them too. And I'll create a new user here. Susan Jones. And I will put Susan into the sales group. Okay, so going back to my file stuff here. So I've created a folder named data, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to share that folder data so it's available over the network. So right now, if I just do a separate window of File Explorer, and I do a /server, so this is simulating browsing the network to see what server does. So server has two shared folders already, netlogon and sysvol. Both of those are system level stuff that are automatically created on all domain controllers. So I'm going to create another share named data. So I'm going to go back to this other window and I'm going to right click on my data folder, go to the properties of it, and I've got a sharing tab. So on the sharing tab, I'm going to click on advanced sharing because I want detailed control. And I'm going to share this folder, and it's going to be shared as a folder named data. Cool. And what are the permissions I'm going to give it? So share level permissions, I'm not going to give full control, but I will give everybody change access. So that means that everybody across the network is able to delete files, modify files that are inside, add new files, but they're not allowed to modify the security permissions. Now there is another level of permissions that we need to be aware of called NTFS permissions that apply at the file level. So share level permissions are kind of like the window. So they're a choke point that control things. So the maximum I can do on the share is modify. But if I go over here to the security tab for the folder, these are what are called NTFS permissions. So these are the ones that are set on the actual folder as opposed to the share. And right now, all users are given read-only access to this folder. And that's okay for our purposes. Administrators have full control access, and then system, full control, basically meaning the computer itself, and creator-owner, anybody who creates files, has special permissions. But we can ignore those for the most part. Now, if I go down and I look at the properties of one of the folders inside my share, like sales, and I look at the security, you can see we've got the same permissions down here. Because what happens is when permissions are assigned at a higher level folder, they flow down to lower level folders. So if users are assigned read access at data, then they're also going to get read to the sales folder and accounting folders inside of data. Now, if we're setting this up as a departmental file share, we don't want it to work that way. Because we don't want everybody getting access to sales files and everybody getting access to accounting files. So, what we can do at the sales folder level is if I go into advanced, what I can do is disable inheritance. Basically saying stuff from up above is not allowed to come down to here. And I'm going to remove all the inherited permissions. And now I can add just what I want. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add back administrators. Because if we don't add back administrators, we can be caught in a scenario where we don't have access to our own stuff. There's a way to get it back, don't worry, but it's a pain in the butt. So administrators, I'm going to give full control, and so we're allowing to this folder and subfolders. And the other one we're going to do is we're going to add, because we're in the sales folder, I'm going to pick that sales group, and I'm going to give them modify permissions. So again, they're not allowed to change the security, but they're allowed to delete stuff, add stuff, modify stuff. Done deal. So sales is allowed to modify, administrators can do everything. Done. So you can see it displays a little bit different here. The check marks were grayed out when they were inherited. Now, because they're applied directly at this point, the check marks are actually black. Now, the other thing you can do if you want to check permissions that somebody has. So, for example, if I want to make sure that the accounting people don't have access, what I can do is I can go to this Effective Access tab, and I can pick a user. And Jeff was our user that was in accounting but not in sales. So before we did that modification to the permissions, all users had read all the way through. So now we should not. So view Effective Access, and it says Jeff has no access. If we go here and pick Susan, who is a member of the sales group, and view Effective Access, she doesn't have full control, but she does have all of the other permissions that allow her to modify. So that's one way you can double check stuff. Obviously, the other way you can double check is actually connect across the network, verify somebody has the right permissions, but when you do that, it's a bit longer of a process. This is quite a bit quicker to just check your effective access in the file permissions. Now, the other thing to do once you have set up file permissions for a share is how do people get access to that? Well, Normally the way you like to give people access to shared folders is stuff you would have seen in the computer lab. You've got a drive letter that's mapped to that folder. So the way we normally do that, if I close all this up, oh, and actually that's worth taking a quick look at there. You can actually see now that if I go to server over the network, my data share is there, and I can browse inside it. So if I want to set up my file shares for people, or sorry, a map drive letter for people, normally we would do that with group policy. And you can see I've got my domain byron.local, and I'm going to set it up. So I'm going to create a new group policy object. So I'm going to create a GPO in the domain and link it at the domain level so that it applies to everybody. And I'm going to call it drive map. And then I'm going to right click drive map and edit it. And I'm going to do user preference, because that's how I normally do my drive mappings. And it should be under control panel settings. No. Sorry, my mistake. Windows settings. So there we go, drive maps. So we don't have any right now. I'm going to create a new one. And I can leave my action as update, because that creates it if it doesn't exist. And no, I don't want to search Active Directory for that. I'm just going to type in the path. So server and data. So that's where it's going to map it. And I'm just going to label it as data. And I'm going to specify the drive letter that I want to use. So I'm going to say that everybody gets this K drive. And we don't need to do anything else here. There are options with item level targeting so that you can do things like, if people are a member of a specific group, do this drive mapping. So you can be pretty fine-grained about it, but we don't need to do that for our purposes. We're just going to do the basics here. So that's our K drive letter. And that is all there is to setting up the drive letter. Now when somebody logs in, it's going to read that policy and it's going to apply to them. So that's setting up file permissions, that is setting up drive mappings, and again, lots of information on the internet about how to do this stuff. We have set it up with Windows Server 2016 here, but the utilities are basically exactly the same for Windows Server 2016 and Windows Server 2012 R2. So if you find 2012 R2 documentation, that's going to get you what you want also. Okay, the last thing I think it's important to show is the bit of configuring the client side here. I've installed Windows 10 on a client virtual machine, and what we want to do is we want to actually join it up to the domain. So first step in that is we need to configure the networking, because this computer needs to be on the same network as our server. So we need to configure TCP/IP properties to match. I guess the other one was 10, so we'll make this 101. Again, no default gateway required because we don't communicate out. But 10 was our server. Our server is where our DNS is installed, so that's why we're pointing it there. And you can see we're sending and receiving some packets. All is good. So we can close that up. Next up is joining the domain. So right click on the start button and go to System. And I want to rename this PC. And I'm just going to call it Client 1. And then we do a quick restart, and then we'll join the domain. So when I installed my Windows 10 machine, I created a user account named local admin. It asks you what username you want to put in there. I put local admin instead of the name of a person. So we're now on the same IP network as our server. We've changed our computer name to be client 1, so something a little more understandable than the randomly generated name that's created by default. And now that we're signed in, we can connect to the network. So again, we'll go system, or sorry, we'll join the domain, I should say, and connect to work or school. Okay, so we don't actually want to set up this work or school account thing. That's different than what we want. We want to join to the local Active Directory domain. And the domain we want to join is byron.local. And we want to the administrator account of the domain and that password. And we're going to skip this step because we're not going to do this add account part. We are going to be doing this from the server side, so we'll see what that looks like normal. So let's restart to join the domain, and then I'll show you how it integrates. So by joining a domain, what we've done is we have actually said we want to integrate the security on our client computer, our Windows 10 computer. We want to integrate that security with the security of our Windows Server 2016. So that's what we'll be able to see coming up. So my local admin account is still here. However, I don't need to use that. So if I click on other user, you can see we're signing into Byron, so that's the domain name. So we're signing into the domain name Byron. Notice one thing tricky though, if I just type the name administrator, it actually wants to log in as an administrator of my local computer. So to work around that, what I actually do is I make sure I type in the domain name first up top here. Then I can log in as the domain administrator. So that domain administrator account that existed on my server as part of joining the domain has permission to log on to this client computer. And as soon as it sets up my profile, once we get inside the workstation, I'll show you exactly why that's the case. Okay, now that we're logged in, let's go to computer management. I want to show you exactly why it is that the administrator from the domain was allowed to log in. So one of the things I can do in computer management is managing local users and groups. So that's what we want to take a look at here. So what I want to show you is that a Windows 10 computer has similar security groups to what you find at the domain level, but these are security groups that are applicable only to the workstation. So I still have administrators of the local workstation. And if I open up my local administrators group on my client, you can see that the group domain administrators or domain admins is a member of my local group administrators. So my administrator account from the domain is a member of domain admins. Domain admins is a member of the local group administrators, and local group administrators has permission to do everything on this Windows 10 computer, including log on. So that is how I can have centralized administration for an entire domain through a single account, effectively. The other thing I want to show you is the local users group has a member named domain users. So any user that is created in the domain can be has the ability to log on to this client computer. So we don't have to run around and create user accounts separately on individual workstations. It's only done once at the domain level, and at the domain level people are allowed to log on. So if you remember before, we created Jeff and Susan. Let's make sure Jeff and Susan can log in. So I'm just going to do a switch account here rather than full-on signing out. So we're going to go for other user, and it's logging into the Byron domain. So I can just put Jeff. And if you recall, when both Jeff and Susan were set up so that their password needs to be changed at first sign in, so it's prompting us now. So we'll put that new password in. Password is changed, awesome. And we're creating the profile for Jeff. So again, you can see the domain user is being used to sign in. We're setting up the profile. And done deal. Jeff is signed in. And Jeff is just a regular user account, not an administrator. So I am going to open up File Explorer here, just so we can verify that that drive mapping got created like it was supposed to. So if I click on this PC, you can see we've got our data drive of K for that drive mapping we created before. And that's from the server side. And again, if you recall, Jeff was a member of accounting but not sales, so Jeff can go into accounting. We can create a new file, but if Jeff tries to go back up to date and look into sales, Jeff is not allowed to go into sales.